So, Lone Rider here, and I want to talk about lessons from Watchung. Now, I spent nearly 3 years, along with many other cyclists and people interested in fair government policy, trying to get mountain bike access here at Watchung Reservation in Union County, New Jersey. Watchung being the biggest local park in the area, actually within biking distance of my house. And mountain biking there was banned by a handful of unelected politicians in a backroom meeting. These unelected government officials just kind of got together and stuck their hands in the air and said, by the power of Grayskull, bikes are banned. And we've been dealing with the fallout from that ever since, for the last 20 years. Now, I'm just old enough that I was one of the very few people who's still around and who's still a cyclist that remembers riding there back in the day. I rode there for a very short period of time in the mid-90s. Around 95, 96, that time period. And I would very much like to ride there again, as would many people. But unfortunately, despite 3 years of promises, despite working with us, supposedly, despite actually hiring a consultant to design a new trail plan, which was supposed to include mountain biking, despite approving the trail plan, despite voting on the trail plan to amend the contract to pay the consultant extra money specifically for the mountain bike part of the trail plan, which they had already said they approved. And despite repeatedly going on the record numerous times to say that they thought mountain biking was a good idea and it should be allowed, the county government ultimately decided to double down on its extra legal ban from 20 years ago. And they not only didn't remove the ban on mountain biking at Watchung, they essentially created new trail closures at every other park in the county by, after 20 years of the ban being about nothing but Watchung, retroactively expanding it to all of the county parks without any more legislative authority than it ever had to begin with, just about Watchung. Mind-blowing. Really, gets you thinking. And, what it gets you thinking about isn't nice. It gets you thinking about how your government conducts itself and what's the relationship between the government and the citizen. And it gets you thinking about a lot of stuff that really doesn't have all that much to do with cycling, but has a lot more to do with civics and with politics and with, the relationship between the government and the citizen. And in that train of thought, I wanted to highlight one specific thing that occurred at the original meeting that we had with the government at the Galloping Hills Golf Course in February of 2014. Now, at this meeting, there were a handful of cyclists who were supposed to represent every mountain biker in Union County. Literally, a handful of people. Less than 5. I was privileged to be one of them. We also had a member of the JORBA, the Jersey Off-Road Bicycling Association. There were several officials from the Union County government. There was a representative of the contractor they had hired at taxpayer expense to design the new trail plan, CMA Associates, a Miss Stanley. Now, there were a lot of things that occurred at this meeting, but the most memorable one was one particular instance where several cyclists, including myself, were describing how arduous the ban was and how our Open Public Record Act requests and research into the history of the ban had really indicated that there was no basis for it. There didn't appear to be any basis in fact in terms of documented problems with mountain biking at the time. The county had no trail studies, no trail surveys, not a single police report of an injury or accident or evidence of trail damage. And the decision itself to ban mountain biking was made by the unelected behind closed doors in a backroom meeting without any public input or knowledge at the time. And we were addressing these points because we wanted it to be clear that the issue wasn't about mountain biking. The issue was about the government's ban on mountain biking and the fact that it had never been justified in the first place. And one of the government people, I don't remember exactly who it was, but one of the government people there who worked for the county said to me this, and to everybody else present. He said, look, quote, what happened years ago was wrong, unquote. But what was more interesting was what he said afterwards. Yes, he said what happened years ago was wrong, essentially admitting what we already knew. But then he turned around and he said this. He said, but let's not talk about that at all going forward. After all, you're here to work with the county to try and come up with a better policy. It doesn't benefit anybody to badmouth the county going forward about past decisions. Wow. Talk about mind-blowing. I mean, you've got a very simple statement there, but there's so many layers to it. It's like an onion. Except it's like a rotten onion, right? Every layer you peel back, it gets worse and worse and worse. I mean, think about the implications of this. Just think for 1 second. He's admitting that the government's policy, the government's current policy, which it enforces to this day, is wrong. But he doesn't want you talking about it. However, he supposedly is willing to help you come up with a better policy going forward, for the reason that the previous policy was, quote, wrong, unquote. Here's the thing. If somebody's willing to admit that the decision that current policy is based on, literally what happened years ago, quote, was wrong, unquote, then why aren't they willing to talk about why it was wrong or have you talk about it? Isn't it necessary as a part of going forward and crafting a better policy? I mean, after all, you have to understand, articulate, and make clear what was wrong about the previous policy in order so that the same flaws aren't embodied in the new one, right? To me, this is obvious. This is putting all your cards on the table. This is being above board. This is like not being a sneaky person. This is not being an asshat. This is being just a regular guy who's trying to do something and get it done and being honest with everybody. You put all your cards on the table, you say, look, this is where we sit. Let's try and make something useful out of this. Let's try and make this a better situation. Hell, let's try and make this a better world, starting with this one small issue. Because, again, it's not really about bike access. It's about fair government policy. And after all, we have one of the government people right here in front of me admitting what happened years ago was wrong. But the same guy is also saying a second later, but let's not talk about that going forward. If he was really okay with admitting that the decision that happened years ago that led to banning mountain biking in a secret backroom meeting of the unelected was in fact wrong, why would he not be okay with talking about it? If he was okay with admitting that it was a bad decision, why wouldn't he be okay with examining why it was a bad decision so that we don't make the same mistakes going forward as far as government policy and park access are concerned? I mean, just a thought. Just a thought. Now, in retrospect, this kind of foreshadowed every single thing that followed. The government stalling for 3 years, the government spending tens of thousands of dollars of taxpayers' money on this new trail plan, voting to approve it, voting to amend the contract to pay them extra for the mountain bike part of the trail plan, then turning around and saying, we're going to cancel the mountain bike part of the trail plan without re-amending the contract. So presumably, the contractor got paid for work they never had to do. Everybody walked away, feeling happy. The government, didn't have to publicly admit that the decision it made years ago was wrong, even though that's what it admitted in a meeting with a handful of cyclists. The contractor got paid for work they didn't have to do, presumably, because again they amended the contract to pay for the trail plan, but they never re-amended it when the trail plan was canceled to not pay them for it. So presumably they got paid for work they didn't have to do. Nobody has a problem with that, right? Everybody loves getting paid extra. And, the anti-bike people who didn't want to have to share and were just used to the way things were without ever bothering to examine whether they should have been that way in the first place or not. It's the status quo and I'm cool with it. Okay, whatever, They were happy because they didn't have to question their basic flawed premises and expectations. But the people who were interested in fair park access and actually revisiting the issue, which is what we thought we were there for, well, we got left out in the cold. But everybody was happy except for those of us who wanted fair park policy. Everybody else was fine. Again, the government didn't have to publicly admit it made a mistake 20 years ago. The contractor got paid for stuff they probably won't have to do. The people who were against sharing the park with bikers didn't have to share. I mean, everybody came out of this with a smile on their face, except for those of us who went into it thinking that we were actually going to get a fair deal from our own government, which is a sad commentary on things. And in retrospect, we should have seen all this coming the moment that one of the key government figures in this initial meeting said to us, let's be clear, what happened years ago was wrong, but let's not talk about that going forward. Why would you say that if you really were ready to admit that it was wrong? If you really were ready to come up with a better policy in its place? Why would you say something like that? Now, I understand if your idea is to work with the government to help create a new policy going forward. You don't want to badmouth that government, and you certainly don't want to antagonize them. It's like poking a bear with a stick. The government gives you a seat at the table. You're expected to work with them, not against them. However, you should not be expected to work against your own interests, or more importantly, the interest of reality and honesty, right? Because that takes precedent over anybody's personal concerns. The question is, what's the truth? The question is, what exists? The question is, what really happened, and what's really happening now to this day, right? The issue isn't, will I get what I want if I just pretend? The issue is, I should not have to pretend that something is not what it is in order to get what I want. Because all I want is to be treated fairly and to have fair government policy and fair park access. And the moment that this individual, and there were like 4 government people at that meeting, and I'm trying to remember which one it was, and I actually can't put a name on it. I want to say Sanchez, but I'm not sure. There were several individuals. I'm not exactly sure which one it was that made this statement. And I'm not, for the first time, I'm saying to myself, I wish I had taken a tape recorder to that meeting. And I actually thought about bringing my MP3 player and setting it in audio, and hitting the record button. But I had two thoughts about that. One was that if somebody saw me doing it and I wasn't able to keep it under the table or something, I was afraid that they would kick me out. And 2, I was afraid that it would set a bad precedent of distrust if I went in there with a recording device. So, here I was, a citizen who's been screwed over by his government for 20 years, and I was concerned about, not setting up a bad vibe. I mean, of all the things to be concerned about, right? But I went into this thinking naively, like it was the First Continental Congress, and I was like one of those guys being sent to Philadelphia. I went into this thinking that this was a great experiment of citizens participating in government, something that I had thought naively that I had been trained for my whole life as a free American. And I hate to tell you, but that's not what it was. It was a sham. It was a scam. It was bogus. And we should have known that from the start. Because, when somebody tells you they're willing to admit that what happened years ago as far as the government policy is concerned was wrong. He didn't say impractical. He didn't say ineffective. He didn't say inefficient. He said wrong. That's not just a pragmatic assessment. That's a moral judgment, okay? He said it was wrong. Wow. That's powerful. But then the next thing he said was, let's not talk about that going forward. If you're really ready to admit that it was wrong, why not talk about it? Isn't it necessary to talk about what was wrong so that we don't make the same mistakes as we move forward, trying to come up with a new policy? This should have been obvious from the get-go. We should have known that we were being played. We should have known that the government had no intention of following through with its intention that it stated numerous times over nearly 3 years of allowing mountain bike access and changing its admittedly wrong, quote-unquote, policy. The fact that they were willing to admit in a meeting with a handful of cyclists that the decision that led to the policy was wrong, but that every time they were contacted by a local newspaper to explain the controversy over the mountain bike ban, they feigned ignorance and actually pretended that they had no idea why mountain biking was banned when they were the very government entity that banned it. Says a lot. Says almost, in fact, as much as that one government official saying, I admit what happened years ago was wrong, but let's not talk about that going forward. What that says to me is they never intended to make good on their promises. They never intended to allow fair park access, and they met with us just to string us along and stall us, or because they literally didn't know what else to do. Remember, at this point, nobody had really been commenting on the mountain bike issue at all. Everybody had just kind of accepted that that was the way it was, and it was only a handful of people like myself and several of the cyclists that got the ball rolling by informing the majority of the public that, wait a minute, they banned mountain biking in a backroom meeting of the unelected without any legislative authority by repurposing an old ordinance from years before that didn't say what they said it was about, that wasn't linked in writing to this ban. The ordinance was from 1983. It wasn't linked in writing to this ban, which was from 1995, until 2014, when people started asking questions about it. There's 3 different timelines for the origin of the ban. In other words, after having 20 years, the government can't even get its story straight. And the ultimate decision to ban us was made by a handful of unelected government officials in a backroom meeting without any public input behind closed doors. There's a lot of fishy stuff going on with this. And when we went into that meeting, that very first meeting, and everybody was all happy and talking about how we're going to allow mountain bike access, we want mountain bike access, this is the thing to do. Nobody ever said, wait, there's a law against it, even though there's not. We just repurposed an old ordinance and we never changed the wording, but we're going to be claiming a couple of years from now that there's an ordinance against this. Nobody ever said that. Nobody ever said, hey, we're getting ahead of ourselves, we have to change legislation. So, they never clearly believed that, at least as far as they were telling us. And, again, one of the government officials tellingly admits what happened years ago was wrong. But then he just as tellingly admits he doesn't want people talking about it. Aha! And this is the lesson from Watchung, folks. If somebody doesn't want you to talk about something, in particular, if somebody that you're working with that's apparently being above board, that's apparently on your side, that apparently wants the same thing as you want, doesn't even want you talking about it, he can spin it as much as he wants. He can say it's a strategic political move. He can say it's, this, that, there, and the next thing. At the end of the day, if he's not willing to come out and say it publicly, you got to ask some hard questions. You got to ask how much they mean it. You got to ask if they're really intent on following through on it. And just like getting something in writing, just like getting a timeline of follow-up meetings, just like, any number of lessons from Watchung, this is something that could apply in any other circumstance when you have to deal with an organization, with the government, etc. If you find yourself meeting with somebody who appears to be on your side, who seems like he's your best bud, who seems like he really wants exactly what you want, but isn't willing to publicly say so, no matter what he admits to you in private, then you've got to seriously ask yourself what the hell you're getting into, because that person is not being truthful to you. Anybody who would say to you, look, let's be clear, what happened years ago was wrong, but then in the next breath say, but don't talk about that publicly going forward, I have to ask myself, why didn't I say to his face, why? I'll never know. I think I was just glad to be included in the process and feel like I was doing something. I didn't have the, the average citizen who's not a professional political creature gets kind of intimidated by these things. I knew all the facts going in there. I knew all the history, or as much of it as I could have eked out through Open Record Act requests and other research at the time. But the idea of being in a meeting with all these government people and them actually sitting down and listening to us, that was like, I don't know how to explain it, but when you've been marginalized and denounced and banned for 20 years, and for the first time, somebody in a position of power and authority seems ready to listen to you and admit that they might have been wrong, it's a very powerful feeling. And it allows you to easily overlook things that should be tripping you up and getting you to check your premises. I should have seen what ultimately happened coming down the pike. But I didn't, because I was tricked, essentially. I mean, these people were like, hey, we want to work with you, man. Just don't talk about it. And they actually gave a fairly, I don't want to say convincing, but a fairly seemingly reasonable explanation that they really wanted to work with us. But look, mountain biking's been banned for so long. So many people are used to it not being allowed, and they don't like the idea of things changing. And so we want to have everything in place before it becomes public knowledge. So that's why we don't want you talking about it. And they really made it sound like the whole reason they didn't want us talking about it was because they were actually on our side. And they were trying to help us change the policy. The reality was, I think they were just planning to string us along all along. And they didn't want us raising these issues. On one hand, the government's trying to pretend that nothing's going to change and everything's going to stay the same, and nobody who's not a mountain biker should worry about mountain bikers actually getting access, despite the fact that out of the other side of their mouth, they're telling the mountain bikers, oh yeah, you'll definitely get access. I think the reason they thought they could work this balancing act is because they had told us that it was in our own interest to not make a fuss. Again, on one hand, the same government official, on one hand, was saying, let's be clear, what happened years ago was wrong, you're right. But then turned around and in the next breath said, but don't talk about it going forward. And tried to make it seem like it was about us being able to work together to get what we wanted. When in reality, I think it was very clear that actually it was about the government maintaining the status quo and keeping things the way they were, and not having to admit that they admitted something was wrong. So lessons from Watchung. Basically, look for those contradictions. Look for those statements that don't make sense. If somebody says to you on one hand, I agree, what happened years ago was wrong, but don't talk about it, ask why. Ask why you're not supposed to talk about it. And if there's a conveniently self-serving answer that seems to benefit you and the other person, don't accept it at face value, okay? Don't accept it at face value. Because the alternative is getting strung along for 3 years and then told to go F yourself. Excuse my French. And I think we could have stopped a lot of this in the beginning if we made it clear that we expected these people to treat this seriously. That we didn't expect it to be like, well, we'll have a meeting with you and then hope you go away. Which I honestly think is what they thought they were going to do. I honestly think they never thought that any of us would ever expect them to follow through on what they said. Which makes me wonder then why I say it. Again, when you tell somebody, yeah, you'll get back to them in a few months, or yes, what happened years ago was wrong. Well, if you're going to admit to me that what happened years ago was wrong, then I expect you to change it. If you're going to say to me, you'll contact me in a few months with the next step, I expect to hear from you in a few months. If I don't, I'm going to be contacting you. And, of course, what happened when I did, I got the runaround, see my other video on lessons from Watchung and getting things in writing. The point here is that this was all foreshadowed. This was all projected in a way by this one exchange, this one sentence in this very first meeting. And we should have seen it coming. Except so many of us, I think, like I said, we're just so glad to finally have somebody listening to us that it was almost like we couldn't see the forest for the trees. The government did a real good job of running a con. What can I say? But at the end of the day, if you're sitting there and you're trying to change government policy, and you see something wrong and you're trying to make it right. Well, let's just say, be aware that when the government talks to you, it speaks with forked tongue, as the old saying goes. And, you can have somebody, the fact that you have somebody who's going to tell you on one hand, you're right, what happened years ago was wrong, and then turn around and in the next breath say, but don't talk about that going forward. Well, why not, if you're really willing to admit that it was wrong and change things going forward? That's what we should all have been asking. We never did, for some reason. And I'll never know why. Again, I don't know whether I was just so caught up in this process and the idea that I was actually finally participating in government and doing all the things that I thought, a citizen should be doing, and, having a say. And, it's not the first time I look back on this and I said, during those 3 years, there were numerous times when friends said to me, are you sure you want to do this? It's a lot of work. And I said, I've been training for this my whole life. Being a free American citizen, right? That's what we do. We participate in our own government. But that's not how the government saw it. They saw it as they were running a con. They were running a stall tactic. They were just saying just enough to get us to go away and hoping that we didn't realize they were saying enough to make us suspicious. And they were. And I don't know why I never picked up on it. But that's the lesson from Watchung here. Make sure you pick up on it, right? When somebody says to you, look, what happened years ago was wrong. We're willing to work with you to change it. But then they turn around and they say, but don't talk about it to anyone else. Okay, so are you really serious about working with us to change it? If you want to keep us, if you want us to keep it under our hat. Really? Lessons from Watchung. Live and learn. Lone Rider out.